Hello, fellow Unreal developers. This video is about adding Unreal 5.6's gameplay ability system to the third-person template. And if you're more interested in starting from scratch, you could watch my previous Getting Started with Gas video made in Unreal Engine 5.4, which is built using the blank C++ project template. In either case, you could use these steps to add to any other project template. And a special thanks to all my supporters. Thank you for helping me help others. Now, this is a new third-person C++ project that I named GG, as in gas game. So the first thing we're going to do is create some C++ classes. However, we go to all classes here. I want to make something based on AttributeSet. So you can see that nothing comes up. This is because if you're making gameplay ability stuff, you want to make sure that you enable the plugin gameplay abilities. So once we've done that and the bottom of the window is hidden, we hit restart now. That'll just relaunch the editor with the plugin enabled. And now when I go to make that class, put an attribute set, and it's here now. So for that, we're just going to create one called GGBaseSet. This will take a minute. It'll just go through its live coding and whatnot. All right, with that done, we can then just create a second one. And this one will be based on the GGBaseSet. So we'll call this one HealthSet, or rather GGHealthSet. And similarly, it'll go through that, do its live coding. All right, with that done, we can then just close the editor. If you had a red bar here because you launched from Visual Studio, you'd want to wait for that to disappear before we hit reload all. So with that done, we'll jump into the base set. However, a step you don't want to miss is in the Build.cs file in our private dependency module names. We can just add in here, and I'll just use the same format as above. We want gameplay abilities, gameplay tags, and gameplay tasks. Similarly to adding the plugin, we need to have this in here so that we have access to some of the stuff we will be using. So in our AttributeSet subclass here, we're going to be using, or at least in the subclass of the subclass, in HealthSet we'll be using a macro. The macro is in the AttributeSet in here. So previous to 5.6, we can go in here, we go to 5, or go to definition, or just hit F12. Down here at the bottom now, this is similar to a comment that was existing before 5.6. But basically it was you can uncomment this section or copy this to your header file, uncomment it, and then you can use this macro to call the other macros and get some utility functions. As of 5.6, they've actually added the macro itself down here, but they have an underscore basic on the end just so that it doesn't collide with the one that was previously created. Not sure why they didn't just include this in previous versions without it being commented, but nonetheless. So with that done, we actually want to override pre-attribute base change and pre-attribute change. So I'm just going to search in this file for pre-attribute. And we have pre-attribute change, pre-attribute base change. I'm just going to copy all this into our file here. Oh, back in there, you can see if you scroll up a little bit, these are public. So we'll just include them in a public section as well. I could delete the center section here. And then you can see that they are currently empty functions. And we just want to throw on a override here. And I'm just going to reverse the order. And then we also want to create a new function, which will have the same parameters here. We're going to call this one clamp attribute on change. This is not an override, but it is a const. And Visual Studio has been a pain lately. It's not giving me the option, like the green squigglies here, to just create those functions. But we can create this one. And unfortunately, it's actually popping up another Visual Studio quirk, is it's trying to add it to the wrong file. So instead, I'm just going to copy these into my CPP file, pop them out. You need to get rid of the virtual. Oops. We want to get rid of the stuff at the end, or the override at least. Just going to order them, so clamps at the top. And then our class name is this. We'll do that in the double colon. And all we're doing with this base set class is pre-attribute or pre-attribute base and pre-attribute will just call clamp, sending along the attribute and the new value. And that's all we need to do with this class. So I like to do the occasional sanity compile. So I'm just going to hit F7. Hopefully that'll go through quickly. And that looks good. So then next we go into our health set. In our health set, we want to add a constructor, which is public. So just copy this. And then we're going to add uProperties for each of the attributes. I'm going to make these blueprint read only and put a category of attributes. An attribute itself is a F gameplay attribute data. And I'm going to start with shield and then reorder it. And then we can use that attribute, if I spell it correctly, accessors basic. And in that, we're just sending along the class name along with the attribute name. And that will create 4 utility functions. So with this, I'm going to copy this or delete it or cut it in that case. I'm going to create it for health, shield, max shield, shield regen, and in damage. So then now I can just start on this one, hit Control F3, back at the top, type health, oops, max health, and then max shield down here, shield regen. And lastly, we're using what's called a meta attribute. This we'll call in damage. The point of creating our in damage here is that we don't want to have gameplay effects that apply directly to shield or health. We want in damage to come in, apply to shield, and then apply to health. And we have all these squiggles that Visual Studio is confused whether it should be red or green, but that's because up here we also need to include ability system component. One other thing we're going to include up here is we're going to create a delegate. So a delegate is basically, this thing is used to make a variable that we can use to subscribe to this event effectively to get that information. So when damage is taken, then we can subscribe to that event and do something with it. This macro is just if you go into definition, there's a whole bunch of them, and they end with the number of parameters, 3, 4, that goes up to 9. To use that then, we want to have a variable. We'll have it as mutable f damage taken event, and we'll just call it on damage taken. And below here, I'm going to throw in public again just to separate the variables from the functions. And this is where we want our virtual void clamp attribute on change, which was taking the gameplay attribute and a float new value. We also want to use the post gameplay effect execute, which I can then go back into our base set to get to the attribute set. It's called post gameplay attribute effect. I'll just copy that, throw that down here. And as you can see, it was also empty. Just calling out that it's empty because we don't need to call a super version in those cases. So again, Visual Studio is not giving me the option to just create those functions. But in our health set, then we have our constructor. In here, we're going to initialize the variables. So we're actually calling the init health or init. It's not showing up the macro values yet, but this will be 40. Let's see why that is. I'll just do a build and complain about the missing functions and maybe something I missed. Oh, well, I did forget that's a U, right? That's what I get for copying it from up there instead of the other side. All right, so now we're good. So then we do the same with init max health. I'm going to set this to 60. Init shield to 0. Init max shield to 20. And init shield regen to 2. And then we'll get our two functions down here. Get rid of the virtual, add the class name. Get rid of the semicolon and the override. And in our clamp attribute on change, we want to check that the attribute being sent in is the health attribute. So again, get health attribute is another of the utility functions created by that macro. So if it is in this case, then we want to set the new value to the clamped value of that new value between 0 and get max health. And then similarly, we can do the same for the shield. If the attribute is our shield attribute, we want to clamp it between that and max shield. The post gameplay effect execute is a lot bigger, so I'm just going to paste it in and explain what it does. However, to get rid of the red squigglies in this case, we also need to include gameplay effect extension. All right, so what's happening here is the first thing is we're checking that the data's attribute coming in is the in-damage attribute. When it is, we're saving it, setting it back to 0, and as long as it's a positive value greater than 0, we go in here. If our on damage taken, this is the delegate, has been bound, then we want to set up the values that we're getting from that data's effect spec for the instigator and the causer, and then we're also using it to get the captured source tags and the magnitude. So the data evaluated data magnitude here is actually the same thing as get in damage up here. And we're calling on damage taken dot broadcast to actually send out that event. So anything subscribed to it will then get the function will be called at that point. So to apply the damage, as long as our shield is greater than 0, we then calculate a new shield based on our current shield minus the damage it's done. We're then going to subtract the current shield before applying anything to it from damage is done. So here, basically, you're either going to have a shield that's higher than in damage done or in damage done higher than shield. And this will basically get the new shield into the value that should be lower and maybe 0. Actually, it might be negative in this case if in damage done is higher. Otherwise, in damage done down here will be negative. Unless they're the same, which all good. And then we're setting the shield value and we're clamping that from the new shield we set up here between 0 and the max shield again. And then down here, as long as there is remaining damage after applying it to shield above 0 and our health is above 0, then we can do the same kind of thing, but we don't need to do this line because it's not being applied to anything past that. But simply our new health is the current health minus the damage being done, and it's being set and clamped just in case. So with all our attribute stuff done, I'm just going to do a sanity compile, and we'll be going into the character. So the first thing we're doing in the character is we're going to include a few new includes. And we always want to put them before the dot generated. Dot generated has to be last. It will complain if you do not do that. To add the interface that we need for the ability system component, we're just adding it here. Public I ability system interface. We're going to be using gameplay abilities and gameplay effects, so I'll just put them up here. And then down in our components section, these are private by default. We just paste this in. What we've put in here is the ability system component itself. So when you're adding new classes in here and you want to access them, like Unreal has done with these components, and we're doing down here with the gameplay ability and effect, you have two options. You can just put them up here as a class like this, or if you don't want to put them at the top, you also have the option of just putting class in here the first time it's shown in this file, and it knows that it's a class pointer. Now the recommendation from Unreal, which they're not following in their own projects, is that instead of using a raw pointer, this should actually be a T object pointer with PTR, not PRT. And similarly, if this was done properly, you can just put the class in there as well. And TObject pointer will work very similar to a raw pointer with a little bit of Unreal magic, let's call it. So we've added our ability system component as a component. The health set is kind of like a component. And then we have a primary and secondary abilities. They're just normal gameplay abilities. And we have an array of gameplay effects, which we're calling default effects. Down here, we have the actions that are being set up by Unreal for this template. Pretty typical set of jump, move, and look. We're adding 2 for primary and secondary action. And then further down after the move and look here, we're going to add a bunch of new functions. So first of all, get ability system component is the one that's required by the interface. Then we're adding an activate ability, an initialize abilities and effects. We're adding the on damage taken. This is the one that was from the delegate up here. We're going to hook that up. Then we have on health attribute change, on shield attribute change. Those are also delegates that will be hooked up a little differently. And for each of these three, we have U function versions just so that a blueprint event can be generated for each of those three delegates. Now a little further down here in our public section, I'm just going to add begin play and post initialize components. These are both just being overridden from the character class or above, like actor. And that's it for the header file. When we go into our CPP file, the first thing we're going to want to do is add a few includes. So we'll include the ability system component again, as well as the health set we created. One thing of note is you include ability system component here, whereas in the header file, we included ability system interface. So down at the bottom of our constructor here, we can just replace this with the creation of the ability system component, the health set, and then we're adding our begin play here. So ability system component and health set are just being create default subobjects, just like any other component you'd be creating. In begin play, we're basically subscribing to each of these delegates. The on damage taken is the one that we created in our health set, and we're calling the on damage taken changed when that happens. So as we saw in the health set, this is the broadcast call is being generated by us. We have that right in here. However, in our ability system component, we also have get gameplay attribute value change delegate, which is a mouthful. And this is a delegate that's created to be called anytime an attribute that's sent to it is updated. So when that happens for the health and shield attributes, we're subscribing to the delegate by adding the call to on health attribute changed and on shield attribute changed. So if we go down into our setup player input component, which is where the enhanced input components actions are being bound to the functions, we can then also add two of our own. So the actions we're using are the primary and the secondary actions. We're using started. This started is called when, like, you click down on the keyboard or button. Triggered, depending on how you have it set up, may be called every single time or every tick when it is pressed down. So we want started in our case. And we're calling the function ActivateAbility, and we're actually sending along a parameter here. So if you want to send along a parameter, all you need to do is when you create the function, it takes the typical down here, f input action value as the first parameter. It's always required. And then whatever extra parameters you add to the end there. So I'm just going to scroll down to the bottom here, paste in a bunch of functions. And first we have our getAbilitySystem component. All that does is return the AbilitySystem component. This again is required by the interface, and it's used in a bunch of stuff that Unreal is doing to get access to that. Next we have our ActivateAbility. This is the one that's being called when the primary action and secondary action are started, and they're sending along the ability class of the ability action. So as long as the ability class is not null, we're using this to call tryActivateAbility by class on the AbilitySys component. Next we have the initializeAbilities function. What this is doing is all it's doing is making sure that there's a valid value, and if so, it's calling giveAbility, creating a new F gameplay ability spec and sending along the ability. So if we go in here and hit Control Shift and space, you can see if we go down to number 2, we're sending along the ability, or number 3 rather, we're sending along the class of the ability, and all the other values have defaults, so we're leaving those alone. If you want to use enhanced input a little differently, you can set the input ID here, which I did in the 5.4 getting started video. So if you're curious about that, you can look there. Next, in initialize effects, we're just getting our effect context ready, and then we're iterating through the default effects so that we can call apply gameplay effect spec to self. And then lastly, we have, or not lastly, second lastly, we have our 3 functions that are all subscribed to a delegate. And as they get called, again, they're just calling the blueprint version of the function, and then we can respond to that in there. Lastly, and post-initialize components, we're calling the super version. We're then initializing the ability actor info. So in this case, the 2 parameters are actor and avatar, or sorry, owner and avatar. So the avatar is generally always going to be the character. The owner can be the character. It could be the player state, or the player controller are 3 popular options. There's different reasons why you'd want to use those. In my top-down shooter series, I use the player state just to show a different way to do it. But player state or player controller might be used if you want your character to be able to die effectively and get respawned, but not lose some gameplay ability stuff, abilities, effects, etc. And lastly, this is where the initialize effects and initialize abilities is being called. So with all that done, I'll compile and I'll see you in the editor. So back in the editor, you can see that they've done a little bit of changes to their 5.6 templates. They also include some variants for, in this case, combat, platforming, and scrolling, or side-scrolling. We're not going to touch on that, but they are in there if you're curious. The first person and the top-down, I believe, also have their own sets of variants. Since a lot of this is already set up, it's a little different than my previous 5.4 video. If you're curious how to do all this from scratch, you can do that in there. But in this case, we want to go into the input actions folder. We can actually just duplicate the jump, and we'll call this IA primary. Duplicate that, IA secondary. And what these are is they're the default input action. Actually, I don't like those popping up, not in the main thing, so go to editor preferences, I'll close that again. In asset editor open location, you can switch it to main window. With that done now, when it pops up, main window. So it is the default for these, except that in triggers, it's using pressed and release. This is handy if you want to differentiate between pressed and release. Just going to hit save all. The primary gets saved as well. And then with our input actions created, which if you were creating from scratch, you just go into input, input action. We go back to here and we have our IMC default. Previously, this would have been in the C++ for the character. As of 5.6, they're putting it in the player controller. So in here, we have in the mappings, we already have those three. We're just going to add our primary and secondary. For these, all we're doing is we're setting up the left mouse button, the right mouse button. So with those set up, we also need to remember that in our third-person character blueprint, we want to search for action. We have our primary and secondary. They have to be set here as well. So if we just go in and play right now, we'll see our third-person character. As long as we click in that window, we hit tilde, we can go show debug ability system. Just going to hit tab, and that will show us some information. So you can see on the left there, our health has been set to 40, the max health 60, and the other values as we set them. Your other option, I'll just stop that and start it again, is once you're in here, you can hit apostrophe right next to enter. You'll get this debug window pop up. You can see at the top there's a little bit of control information. If we hit 3 on the numpad, it'll switch to abilities, and that'll give us much the same information. The little camera update there is actually hiding some of the other attributes, but that's what that looks like. So with that, we're going to go back to our content folder. We're going to create a new folder called gas. In here, I'm going to create a gameplay effect. So when you create a gameplay ability, you can go in here, you can just do a search for ability, and you can see there's gameplay ability blueprint. That's all good, but if we do a search for gameplay, and you don't have to type effect in this case, but you can see that there's no gameplay effect. Instead, the way that we create that is we go into blueprint class, and then under all classes, we need to type in gameplay effect. So there we have our gameplay effect. We could do a GE_default attributes. So in here, just going to add 2 modifiers. Pop this out a little bit. So for both of these, we're going to use health and max health. We want them both set to override. This duration policy is instant. We're just applying this when the character is created through the default effects. It just will set these values to 100. So with that done, we need to not forget to put it into our third-person character. And in this case, it's our default effects. So we can add an entry to the array, throw in our default attributes, and then when we hit play, what should we see? Well, what we do see is health set to 60, max health set to 100. So it is working, but it's working a little different than you may expect. What happened here is we set health to 100, but then the clamp ability on change function got called, and it clamped health from the current value of max health, which at that time was 60, and then max health just gets set to 100. So to fix that, we simply need to remember in our gameplay effect that we want to set our max health before health. So for that, we just drag this up here, and that's resolved. Oh, I also like to have compile also save. So I just put save on compile always. That's why there's a little asterisk up there. All right, so if we do this now and we hit show debug, we can see that health is actually set to 100 now. So next we're going to create another gameplay effect. So same way, we go in here, create a gameplay effect, our subclass gameplay effect. We're calling this GE Shield Regen. And in here, this is just an effect that we're going to have, and it's going to be infinite. So we just want this on the player, always working. So for this, we're adding 1 modifier. It's going to be affecting shield. And it's going to add, and the value that it's affecting shield by will be based on another attribute. And once you expand that, you have a backing attribute. If we ignore everything else, we can then just choose Shield Regen. And then up here under period, we want to just throw in 1 for 1 second. So every second, Shield Regen will be added to shield. So if we start that and we quickly get into the show debug, you can see that the shield is not working because I have to add it in here first. So now that it's on the character, you can see the shield value now is going up by 2 every second, and of course it will be capped at the max shield value. Next step, we're going to do a gameplay effect. And this one we're calling GE damage. And in here we're adding a modifier for in damage. So again, we're not affecting health or shield directly, we're just adding in damage, and we'll be adding a value to that. And in this case, we can just add 15. And while gameplay effects are usually applied through gameplay abilities or similar, that is not a requirement. So in our third person character, we can just go in here, go into our IA secondary. And in here under started, we can just call control click out ability sets component and apply gameplay effect to self. We choose our GE damage. And to show this a little easier, I'm going to add a tick event. And all tick will be doing is be printing a string. We're going to append some values so that we can make it look a little better. Add a few pins. I'm going to be showing health. And down here, shield. And if we just want to get those values very easily, we can use the ability system component, and we call get gameplay attribute value. We're choosing one for health and the other for shield. So then when we play, oh, I did forget the one thing. In our print string, we don't want it spamming, so we can take off print to log and set our duration to 0. Alternatively, if you did want a duration, you could set that to any value, and then a key here, you just set some, I think this is an F name, you just set this to some value, and it will not overwrite that string as well, so it'll accomplish the same thing. There we have our health is there, and our shield is going up very slowly. If I right click, you can see that the shield went down by 10 and the health went down by 5. If I let the shield get all the way up to 20, if I right click once, the shield will be up 5. And then if I right click again at 11, it went down and the extra in damage then applied to the health. So working as intended. Another nice and very common thing you're going to want to do with applying damage and some other stuff is I'll duplicate this. I'm just going to call it GE damage set by caller. And in here, instead of using a flat value, we can switch the float here to a set by caller. Set by caller requires a data tag. So we just go in here, we hit plus. I'm just going to call this damage.setByCaller. We have to select our source and then hit add new tag and select it. So with that done, we will then create a gameplay ability, which again, we can just find in here. It's actually in the blueprint section. It's actually in 2 sections, but here's one. And then it asks you what your base class is going to be, which is just gameplay ability for us. And we'll call this GA underscore self damage. So in gameplay abilities, you have an activate ability event, and there's a few things you need to keep in mind. First of all, there's 2 things you want to always be calling in here. You want commit ability. What commit ability is doing is it's going to take care of cooldowns and resource costs. We don't have those in this video, but still. Good to know, and that should always be called, and we want to check that return value. Secondly, you always want to call endAbility. If you do not, and you try to activate the ability again, it just won't work. So because endAbility should always be called, what I like to do is just throw a little sequence in here and call endAbility at the end of that sequence. So what we're doing in here then is we're just calling commitAbility, drag that out, hit B for a branch. And then there's a few ways you can do this, but to get the ability system component, and that's the only thing you need in your gameplay ability, you can call functions that end with from actor info. So you can get your avatar actor or your owning actor or your ability system component right from that. There's even a skeletal mesh component from actor info. We're using get ability system component. And with that, we want to make an outgoing spec. This will be based on the damage set by caller that we just created. We're using that to assign tag set by caller magnitude. This is the tag we set for our damage.set by caller. The magnitude in this case, we can just set it to 10. Need to hook that up. And then to actually apply that, we drag out from here and we have apply gameplay effect spec, in this case, to self. Make sure that we hook up the spec handlet as well, because if you try to compile otherwise, it will complain, which is good. We like those complaints. And then lastly, we want to go back into our character. And we're looking for our primary ability, and we can just assign it here. So now when I play, we have the shield going up. I just right-clicked to get into the window, and it applied the 15 damage. Now, if I left-click, it'll go through the gameplay ability and apply 10 damage instead. So shield of 10, back down, down by 10, down by 10, and of course it goes into health when the shield is knocked down to 0. Now, if you've ever been asked, why are you hitting yourself? You may not want to use self-damaging abilities. Instead, you can check out some of my other gas-based videos for some more interesting abilities like fireballs and frost breath and swarm missiles, the first two in my top-down shooter playlist. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video and would like to see more, you know what to do. And if you would like to support this channel, watch these videos 2 weeks early, or just want to download the project files, you can do so through my Patreon linked below.